All right, as promised, this is the conclusion to our slides as we discussed during class 14 about human enhancement. And so we've talked about or introduced different areas that we should consider when we think about the consequences of allowing human enhancement. So we've already discussed consequences, talking about cost-benefit analyses and costs in a variety of different manners. And then our last slide, at the end of class, we discussed issues that are raised about autonomy. And so now we want to discuss justice. So as we think about distributive justice, we want to think about if these technologies, if they're available, should they be available to everyone? And if they are available, do we create two unequal groups of people, those that are enhanced versus those that are not? Many people do express concerns that unequal access, which is quite certain to happen because of the expense of enhancing technologies, will widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So this is a pretty important area that we should consider. We can also raise the question of cheating and fairness. We ask the question there at the bottom, if we just change the rules, do we eliminate this concern? Some people may say yes. But let's just back up and say, okay, one issue that has been raised first by the President's Council on Bioethics is that this can give an unfair advantage. And obviously in athletics, we might say that human growth hormones, steroids, EPO could give an unfair advantage, although we've already discussed how there are additional advantages where you can mimic such things like with EPO using altitude chambers or even perhaps by where you live. But in school or a career, we should think about items like methylphenidate or modafinil, which are cognitive enhancers, as we've already discussed. And even in certain careers, physical enhancements could ensure success. Some have suggested that enhancement is just cheating based on the current rules. And actually, Michael Shermer is one that would say that basically we eliminate this concern if we just change the rules. Michael Shermer is a skeptic and a humanist. He would certainly not consider himself a Christian. But clearly, we might say, and actually the President's Council on Bioethics has said, that Shermer's position ignores the fact that all of our human activities, whether it's sports, education, or careers, they're practices, and we value the doing, and we don't only value the outcome, or we don't only value what gets done. And this enhancement changes something about the value of the doing in many cases. So the next consideration that we listed earlier was human dignity. How does allowing the use of human enhancement affect the concept of human dignity? So some of the big ideas that we really want to think about are an appreciation of what is naturally given. Now, the question might arise, and we discussed or mentioned the idea of the steroid era in baseball, and you all are probably too young to remember when the home run race was going on, when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were vying to break Roger Maris's record. Many people would say that they appreciate less McGwire and Sosa's feat because it has now come out that they were using performance-enhancing drugs, whereas Roger Maris did not. And so that's a valid consideration. We also need to consider the whole idea of human activity and the dignity in that. The President's Council on Bioethics would define this as the relationship between doer and deed. We also discussed historically, and I'll recall to your mind the idea that the physical is less important than the spiritual, and that in many cases we denigrate or undervalue our physical body. And some types of human enhancement certainly put us in a position where we think of our body as a piece of equipment. And in addition, we might say that we're compromising the distinctly human character. Some would argue that the root of human nature is intelligence. And those are the people that tend to advocate for enhancement. But others argue that enhancement, particularly extreme enhancement, will fundamentally change human nature. Enhancing our minds and our bodies changes who we are, because the sum of who we are as humans lies in the fact that we are embodied souls and ensouled bodies. We've already mentioned ensoulment earlier in terms of thinking about embryos and when personhood should be granted, but we need to think about what ensoulment means, that we do have souls. Some would argue that ensoulment is a process and that enhancement will significantly alter that process. And you may say that ultimately we're medicalizing human achievement. Okay, so in addition to thinking about these big considerations, let's talk a little bit about the psychological impact of having human enhancement. So, does this impact your individuality? There is behavioral control that might be squelched in children that affects the development of their individual personality and strength. I think we would all agree that diversity is a cornerstone in a successful society, and will enhancement minimize that diversity? Will people have psychological impacts because they feel like a failure because they are unable to achieve without drugs? And again, we've already said some people will not be able to afford such enhancements. Are we able to accept our finitude or our creatureliness? We've already alluded to the fact that many in the trans and post-human movement would say that they are attempting a form of immortality. As human creatures, is that something that we should embrace? And the idea that we can be immortal. And then the idea of valuing others no matter what their abilities are. Again, eugenics comes up here as we think about the idea of enhancing humans. What happens to those who are not enhanced? So enhancement gives way to eugenics because value is placed on ever-increasing levels of normality. Again, normality in the sense of who defines that. And then individuals who cannot be enhanced because they're below normal in some area, will they not be viewed as lacking or even potentially be marginalized? So, what might be a Christian perspective on enhancement? Some people would accuse Christians who are wary of enhancement or this type of technology of being Luddites. The Luddites were an anti-technological movement early in the 19th century. They were known to go into factories during the Industrial Revolution and destroy machines. And so, on what biblical basis would we support human enhancement, or on what biblical basis would we caution against human enhancement? We do need to keep in mind a Christian perspective on the role of medicine. We need to keep in mind that we are fallen human creatures, and what are we trying to accomplish with the use of medicine or other enhancements? Christian anthropology helps us define what it means to be human from a Christian perspective. We are made in the image of God, imago Dei. But we also need to recognize that God is interested in the process or our sanctification than He is in our original abilities. You can look at Romans 5, James 1, and 1 Peter 1 and see how God is very interested in the process, and our ability is just a piece of that. We need to think about the purpose of technology and measure that against God's word and will. Are we opening the door to the idea of salvation by works because the outcome is so important? This may be a theological red flag. And then finally, we need to think about wisdom in recognizing human limitations. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." One thing that didn't make it on the slide that I just want to mention that we didn't bring up in class, I just want to remind you that all throughout human history there have been people who have said that the body and the physical was not important and that our soul or our intellect or something like that was the most important thing. We see this come up in many different ways. We've already talked about the trans and the post-human movement, but it could also be said that a denigration of physical reality is true also in the transgender movement. And in all these places, we are minimizing the physical, perhaps in some cases in an unhealthy manner, and elevating some other part of us. God made us as ensouled bodies, and bodies with souls or ensouled bodies. So both of these pieces are important, and to neglect or denigrate one usually leads to some kind of bad theology or other psychological or other problems. So we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. So this concludes our slides about human enhancement. I will see you after spring break.